Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another in the series Curating Culture. I'm Georgette McGlashan Miller, Research Fellow at the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank, and today our guest is Dr. Lisa Tomlinson. Please help me to make Dr. Tomlinson welcome. So, let me tell you a little about Dr. Tomlinson from her bio. Lisa Tomlinson is a senior lecturer and head of Department of Literatures and English at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. She is the author of The African Jamaican Aesthetic, Cultural Retention and Transformation Across Borders, and Una Marson from the Caribbean Biography series. Her expertise lies in film, literary studies, and visual culture. Lisa is currently the Deputy Festival Director and Chief Judge for the Gutfest Film Festival, as well as the Chief Adjudicator for the Creative Writing Competition for the Jamaica Cultural Development Commission and Chair of the Board of Studies Performing Arts Unit, Excelsior Community College. Help me to welcome Dr. Tomlinson again. We are in for a treat.
Thank you very much, Georgette. We are definitely in for a treat. I know Una Marson is, as students once said, every academic has a cultural or an academic possession, and Una Marson is that cultural or academic possession for me. So we're going to begin today with just general information about Una Marson and also information that I think that needs to be on our radar, given that Una Marson had such a grand impact on the cultural and literary and activist landscape of Jamaica, but often forgotten. So I'll just start off with a brief bio of Una. Una Marson was born on May the 5th in rural St. Elizabeth. So all the Sainty out there. Um, she's born 16 years after Claude McKay, novelist Claude McKay. I know she followed in within his literary tradition, and people always say to me, why do you have to mention Claude McKay when you mention Una Marson? Well, I always see Una Marson as I guess, the female version of Claude McKay. And I say that with pride and with, I say that with confidence because 16 years later, Una Marson, all of what McKay did through his literary works in terms of valorizing and championing African Jamaican aesthetics, as well as political activism, both in Jamaica and particularly abroad. Una Marson did very much that. In fact, I would say not that she did more, but she was a part of that international conversation when we talk about Black internationalism. The period where we were looking for the Black diaspora was looking for a Black voice. African American would say that Negro voice. So she was a part of that conversation where she was able to bring forth a Black voice in terms of identity affirmation of Black literary, not just literary, but just Black culture and aesthetics. This was after post-emancipation. So I use that as a comparison because I want to stress the importance or the significance of Una's of work, the way we do Claude McKay. So that is why I usually tend to pair the two. And also, Claude McKay is one of my also cultural or academic possession. So let me just start with her early poems. Just a little background. It's important that we look at her early poems because her early poems, Una Marson's work, like many poets working during that time, was shaped by her colonial education. She attended Hampton High School and at the time an all-girls school. So she would have been entrenched, she would have been indoctrinated into this colonial way of thinking. And when we say colonial education, it wasn't just learning about the poetics of British literary structure, but it was about this type of way in which we saw it as superior versus let's say, Caribbean literature, which didn't even exist. So through her colonial education, her poetry reflected that, her earlier poetry. So a lot of her poems would be within that trajectory. So her first poem collection of poetry would have been Tropics Reverie. And in that collection, she would have used a literary structure that was very reflective of Britain or British literature tradition. So the rhyme, the standard language, and even in terms of the subject matter. So she would be engaging a lot of areas of nature, the romantics, so to speak. Again, Shakespeare, that Kipling, that type of formula, I would say, literary formula. So it's important to know that, and why it's important to know that, as she used these earlier model to express herself or to express a what would be at the time Caribbean identity, it wasn't much speaking to Caribbean identity. There were some areas where she talked about womanhood, her racial identity, again, was not prominent. So we weren't really hearing or feeling the rural areas where she came from, or rural areas she came from, nor were we getting a sense of Jamaica, the language, the people, right? So that was the first, I would say, describe her earlier poems, where it really took the structure of European model. And doing so, it would have been an omission of the lives of the Jamaican people, Black working class Jamaican people. And of course, her second collection, Heights and Depths, also took this very form. There were some hints of her activism because, for example, in Heights and Depths, she would have been, exploring relationship, particularly the context of patriarchy, women's place, and questioning how women saw themselves. So we did get a sense of her her political activism, if you want to say. But again, it stuck within the frame of the Romanticism, which didn't really work outside. And at the time, too, Romanticism, if you're familiar with those types of poems or that type of literature, it wouldn't have really allowed women to explore, right? It wouldn't really allow women to explore issues or especially controversial issues. So it was very much limited in that way. So that would be a mild introduction to Marson's earlier poem. And again, I did this setting the stage to show how she now becomes culturally aware. And her cultural awareness, literature, her literary work that is grounded in her cultural awareness now becomes impactful ways in which she participates in the conversation, Black internationalism, and not just outside of Jamaica, outside of the region, but where she begins to now contribute to that discussion. So her first collection of poem, for example, would have specifically Moth and Stars. That was 1837. And that poem collection comes out of her experience living abroad in England. And like many of our writers and intellectuals who migrated to England, Claude McKay, even though he went to the US, even when he goes to England, we they come across this, I guess, rude awakening, if I could use that word. This rude awakening where they leave as British subject. So, technically they're British subject. They're taught in a very British traditional way. So when they leave now and come into England, they're expecting, coming to the mother country, not the motherland, but the mother country now, because the motherland would be Africa. And
Exactly.
Africa was not in that formula. It was not a part of that, their experience right now, right? They're going to England and they're going as British subject. So Yuna going as a British subject, like the other writers before her, and even after her, she comes, as I mentioned, this harsh, rude awakening where she now realized, wait a minute, I'm not British. I'm not just, I'm a Jamaican or Caribbean, but I'm Black. So she comes to a racial awareness around racial, around her color, right? She had experienced what Jamaicans would call colorism, but she didn't experience the racism that was compounded. Because when she went to Hampton, she talks about the prejudice that she experienced because she was on a scholarship, and she was always reminded of this little Black girl. So she was used to that. Her sisters were favored over her because they had lighter skin. So now she's faced with race, which is still, colorism is still racism, but now she's faced with the bigger manifestation, which is now racism. So in England, she comes across, she's denied jobs. She's told that you're qualified, but you just can't work here because you're a black woman. Housing also is a problem. She can't get into housing. And now we see her poems, and this is why I was giving a discussion earlier about her romantic poems, because now her poetry and her work begins to reflect that experience. Now it begins to shape how she sees herself as a black woman. So now she's no longer British. She accepts that. So within her poem, we see a lot of her poem now starts to speak about black identity, affirmation, affirming who she is as a black woman. So, for example, she uses a poem, Kinky Hair Blues and Black is Fancy. And these are poems that specifically speaks and affirm a black aesthetics and a black aesthetics in terms of hair, how you groom your hair, issues that we're still working out today. Bleaching, skin bleaching. I wanted to read just a small section of Kinky Hair Blues just to give an example of how what her poetry would have sounded like versus the earlier romantic poems. I don't have a poetry voice like Georgette over here. All righty. So, all right. So, just a short section where, Marson talks about in her experience coming now to this racial awareness about who she is. Before that, she was writing much more harsh poetry. And I said before that because when she had just come to England, she had written a poem called Nigger. And that poem was very harsh because she spoke about how she was walking through the town of London and how she felt not belonging, how she was being stared at by white British children. So that poetry now really sparked the later poems. In fact, Marcus Garvey, when he saw that he commented on her experience. He said that he heard about this young lady one of us, who came to England as a British subject. He was like sort of jeering her, saying, she came as a British subject, but like all of us, we realized later on that we are not British. So that was just another example of how, she comes to these types of poetry. So here she says, and this is Kinky Hair Blues. So in this poem, Marson rejects process hair as she objects to falling prey to the white beauty standards. All right, I'm gonna try. Going find a beauty shop, cause I ain't a lovely belle. The boys pass me by, they say I'm not so swell. See other young gals, so slick and smart. I just go and die on the shelf if I don't make a start. I hate that ironed hair and that bleaching skin, but I'll be alone if I don't fall in. So again, you hear in her voice Marston's concern about the rejection that she possibly encountered from black men as a result of, her choice to wear a natural hair. So again, that affirmation that she's not going to cream her hair or she's not going to bleach her skin in order to fit in. And also, too, on a larger note, it was a departing from her conventional poetry, where she would have been engaging in issues that were political. Another poem that I wanted to mention from that particular Moth and Stars that was also very significant was her poem. I don't have a. I think I have a. I don't have the page. I forgot the page number, but this is a poetry where she talks about stone. I totally forgot the name of the poem now. How is that happening? All right. Anyhow, the poem, it's important that I mention this poem because this poem, it was about black working class women who were crushing stone on the sidewalk. So she begins to understand the political uh, implications around black women. She's intersecting now. And when I say intersecting, she's just more or less making connection to race and gender. So she's now taking on a feminist stand. So that poem also appears in The Moth and Star, where she's now beginning to not just talk about these racial issues that she's affected by, but also even what is happening in Jamaica that she's bringing out. Because Moth and Stars was a book, a collection of books. It was endorsed by James Weldon Johnson, who was a part of the Harlem Renaissance and who was her biggest proponent. And I say biggest proponent because he also encouraged her to get that, right, to adapt to that voice, a voice that would speak to the reality and the experiences of Black people in Jamaica and also the wider diaspora. So I wanted to mention that poem. And also her other poems, I won't get into the other poems. What she was doing also as she articulated, because they were very much political, she started to use aesthetics that were African American. So she was very much, again, as I mentioned, she was very much connected. She began to be related to the, if I could say, related to the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was a very wide movement that was at the time internationalism, and that was also impacting and influencing writers from different corners of the globe. Una Marcy being one of them. So doing that, she took on, for example, the Kinky Hair Blues that I read the poem. She used African American vernacular. She Cinema Eyes. There was a collection of jazz poetry where she was using a jazz aesthetics, a jazz literary jazz aesthetic, and I stress literary jazz aesthetics because she wasn't doing the romantic, so she would have been moving away from the classic literary aesthetics. So again, she was really that cultural awareness was really shaping the way she was moving forward with her work, and that book, that collection of poetry was testament to the ways in which she started to become aware of herself. And during that time as well, it's important to note too, aesthetically, she also changed the way she dressed, more Afrocentric. She wasn't creaming her hair or perming her hair. Different things that she started to do. The jewelry that she wore was very reflective of a very Afrocentric style. So we see that cultural awareness now begins to mold her, and not just her personal life, but was molding her work. Alrighty. And then, importantly, before I move on to the next section on the diaspora, Eula Marson was very much criticized for her work. She had distractors. Her distractors, for example, didn't think that her work was meeting or fitting in with the literary canon. So that literary canon would have been British. So, for example, when she did the book of poetry, or Moth and Star, she was criticized for her use of the local Jamaican language. So, what we would call patois, right? Again, even though, mark you, before that, Claude McKay had used two books of poems where he had used patois, but he was criticized, but not as heavily as Una Marson. So she was criticized that her work was just the language the choice of language that she used was out of place or misplaced. She was also criticized for taking on the jazz aesthetics that I spoke earlier on, the jazz rhythmic poetry that she produced. So she was highly criticized, and some of the criticism was also about, it was more about style, but the nuance, it was very much nuanced that the topics that she was dealing with at the time, they weren't ready for it. Not even just they weren't ready for it, but it was coming from a woman,
Right.
right? It was coming from a woman. Again, if I could mention Claude McKay, some of his earlier poems that were written in the local Jamaican language had some political context where he dealt with race and class. The Apple woman complaint, for example, a vendor who is being pushed off of the street because she's selling. So he's engaging in terms of gender, class, and race issues. But it wasn't criticized. He's actually praised for it, saying, he's
As a male.
as a male, but as a woman, writing at the time, it just didn't cut. So that is something that I want to throw out there. So her support mainly, came from the States. Yeah, the U.S. And again, members of the Harlem Renaissance. So Claude, her, and it was interesting because she didn't want to go to the U.S. That wasn't where
Yeah.
she wanted to go initially because of the segregation and just the stories that she would hear about the U.S. And for her, going to England was going to the mother country, was going home. So she didn't want to go to the US. So that is where she garnered her support. I mentioned James Weldon Johnson, who was her pen pal. They never met each other, but she would send her work to him and he would evaluate it. And it was, again, he supported the way in which the choice that she made, the literary choice that she made, and how she structured her poems, and now how she was going to take into account the black voice, or this black voice that she that they would refer to as a new Negro. And again, I keep stressing that this was a while it was she was involved in a cultural renaissance in Jamaica, this was also very much on a broader scale, because now this was a way in which a part of a Pan-Africanist discussion. Because when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we tend to look at it as a very political. We forget
Yeah.
about the cultural aspect of it. You know, how Marcus Garvey talks about how, and Marson actually speaks about it. She says, a culture, a race is valued through their cultural production. And one of the important forms of our cultural production is literature.
Right.
And she was engaging in that very much. So, moving on to diaspora, I touched a bit on diaspora, and I also wanted to kind of bring it out some more because, again, I think it's very important. One of the important things about our Caribbean writers, and looking at Una Marson, the uniqueness that they brought to the internationalism, the international politics, was a diaspora sensibility. Like Claude McKay did the same thing. And sometimes they're seen as odd. In this case, Una Marson wasn't seen as odd. And the diaspora is very important because even before we had the word diaspora, we see persons or writers like Una Marson engaging and actually articulating a diasporic sensibility without even the name. And she does this through her poems. One poem that stands out was Kwashi Comes to London. So Kwashi Comes to London is maintaining this bond to Jamaica and Jamaican roots. And it's a lighthearted poem, but it is, while it's a lighthearted poem, it is serious because what it does, it highlights the immigrants' experience in these metropolitan areas and how they are often isolated. They don't have that belonging. And this is how Marston was feeling. They don't have the belonging, they're isolated. And usually, we writers, they tend to use language as a way to express that urge, that longing for home. What Una Marston does in her poem, she uses foodway. There's a Heather, uh, Heather Hetherington, I think Heather Hetherington, she uses a term called, or sorry, Heather Hathaway. She uses a term called foodway. And why this is significant is because in the poem, Kwashi Comes to London, Una Marson uses the foodway now to express that isolation, to express that non-belonging, to express, and it's very serious because it's a coldness. And this is how Una feels through her entire time in England. Because even when she leaves and come back and go back and forth, that going back and forth was always a way for her to release herself. It was always a way to kind of refuel and come back, because she always had a bitter, sweet relationship with England. So while She Comes to London, as I noted, is a more lighthearted poem, and it more or less highlights the experiences of the homesickness that immigrants face. So in this poem, she uses the foodway that I mentioned by Heather Hathaway. And as she uses the foodway, I'm going to read a page from it. She uses the foodway to capture that loneliness. So here we have Kwashi, right? She's also using the local language. So that's important that I need to mention as well. well, which is groundbreaking for this period. And it's also, when she uses it, she gives it a greater weight. So she gives it some currency because she's allowing her character, her Jamaican character in London, to speak in non-standard English, also speaking the Jamaican language. So it's like a Shinehead song, I'm that Jamaican,
Right.
that alien living in New York. Well, this is who Kwashi is. He's that alien living in London, right? So he's allowed to use his language, and he centralizes his language, and he's giving us an insight into his homesickness from his Caribbean, I would say his African diet. So he walks the street of London, and then he uses this. So this time he's lamenting on his loneliness, and unlike the poem "The Little Brown Girl," Kwashi is completely, he speaks for himself. So that's something that I need to make mention as well. In Little Brown Girl, where Marson expresses that loneliness and isolation, it's done in a very conventional literary, British literary conventional tradition. But here now she's using his voice. So she says, and here I go. So Kwashi confidently speaks for himself. And he says, and sometimes, just when I feel grand, they're sitting all alone. Them play some tune that take me home in sweet and soulful tone. And the tears them well up in my eyes, and I try to brush them where. But my heart gets full, and though I try, them simply come to steer. So Kwashi comes to London. He more or less it reintroduces that diasporic sensibility, and then he goes on to say, so this is where, so we feel his loneliness here. So this is where now we hear Kwashi's homesickness demonstrated, referencing to food. So here he's looking around for Jamaican food, and he says, he enters a restaurant and he tries to order cuisine alien to the British diet. So he says, some ripe breadfruit, some fresh ackee, and saltfish too, and dumpling hot well suit. So when Squashy learns that he cannot indulge in his native food, right? He resorts to ordering anything, commenting, "It's then me miss me home sweet home, me good old rice and peas, and I say I is a fool for come to this land and starve and sneeze." So that's just a part of, just to show Marston's poems that are, again, basing it on Kawashi's personal experience, can also be very collectively and directly connected to the migrants coming from the Caribbean. So I thought that was the diasporic sensibility that she uses in her work. I find it was very important to bring out this morning or this afternoon that we're in now. Yeah. And I just want to move on now to her plays, and I'll just speak about one play. I don't know how much time I'm having. How much time do I have?
Producer, how
Okay.
much time do we have?
Just keep going. Okay. All right. I could be here all day. All right. So, Marson, so that was her poem, her collection of poems that I went through, Moth and Stars. That was really the template where she was able to now begin to assert. I think by then she knows who she is. She knows what she's up against. It's no longer what was seen as a ranting or this bitterness because I'm not getting my own way in this country, but it was her reality and the the isolation that she was feeling, and also not just the isolation, the racism that she was witnessing that others were also sharing, because this was a time too when a Caribbean people were making that mark or migrating to London, and this would have been a part of that migration struggle, right? Where they're coming as British subject, but finding out that, sorry, not
Not
quite
British
British, not
enough.
British enough. So her plays, I'll just mention one of her play for time's sake. And her plays, Marcin also wrote several plays, and her plays, like her book of poetry, were also very much written in a similar vein. Her play Puckamania it wasn't, say, diasporic. And I chose Pacomania because one of the activism that Marson engaged in Jamaica was a cultural literary renaissance. So again, taking the lead of Marcus Garvey, developing a culture. I spoke about it in its context of race, of a race of people having a culture, and that is how they're respected. In the context of Jamaica, the plays, what Marston's work did was more on a national level, where she was trying to uh, promote this cultural renaissance for on a national level, where she was trying to encourage, because she was a part of a lot of different poetry organization, where she was trying to say, look here, it is time now that we use our cultural aesthetics to begin to express our cultural reality, right? So
And to
the,
infuse the arts.
not to and how to infuse the art. So it wasn't just now about even using the language, as we see with Miss Lou. Respect to
Right.
her, right? So for Luna Marson, because it was only a few of her poems where she uh, used Jamaican local
Jamaican.
language, but Pocomania, particularly, this poem was one of the ways in which we would insert, affirm a African or Black Jamaican aesthetics or presence. Because first of all, Pocomania departs from Christianity. It's an African-centered religion. So the play being centered around an African religion, again in itself is groundbreaking. Because what she does in this play, the main character Stella, that I always think is her, is naively has no understanding of Poco, doesn't know what it is. She's afraid of it. So she wanders off to try to learn all about it. Sister Kate, who perhaps I say represents her cousin, who she shared a very close relationship with. She wasn't close to her mother. She was very distant. There was a kind of
Yeah.
a relationship wise. So I think Sister Kate now guides Stella, the protagonist, into understanding Poco, taking away that fear. So this play would have been radical, not just because it's Poco, it uses proverbs. It was the drumming itself being on stage. So even the setup on stage. So again, re I wouldn't say I guess recalibrating drama or theater, a Jamaican theater that is not reflective of British standard or British
At all.
theatrical. Pardon me?
At all.
At all. So it moved totally away from that. And also, too, just to mention, Stella came from the middle class. Una Marson is from a middle class, right? She is from a middle class family. However, even though she's from a middle class, she would have still witnessed, she would have still had some contact, or not some, she would have had contact with the language. And her father was a parson, but she would still have understanding, not full understanding, because not
But
everybody
probably
understands. So
familiarity.
familiarity, that's the word I'm looking for. She would have had familiarities with Pocomania and with these African, what we see as African oriented aesthetics. And all of that she was able to put in her work in this play, Pocomania. And that is why I chose Pocomania, because it was an African centered religious practice, and it was also challenging middle class respectability, right? And Christianity.
Christianity.
Again, when we look in the play, the woman Stella, there's some, feminist nuances in it because she's supposed to get married, and there's some challenges around it that she's assertive, etc. But for the most part, what stands out is the authenticity of the play and the ways in which Marson is able to use these pieces, right? These like, thread together these different aesthetics form that are of African, Jamaican origins or aesthetics. So I wanted to share that play with you. Other plays that she had used also take on not necessarily those said aesthetics that I spoke about, but they do engage issues. For example, London Calling, they do engage issues of race, class. So again, she's exploring the Jamaican society because again, what Una Marson did, she was able now with this race consciousness because and she that is sharpened. She has a more I guess she's able to intersect them. She's able to see them now, not in isolation. She's able to see now how they. Oh, I don't want to use the term intersect because that's so like what's intersect, but she's able to connect them now. She's able to
Connect
connect
them
the
and
dots.
see how
Yeah,
they
she's able to
work with
see
each
how
other.
to work with each other. Because even when she comes back, the classism becomes even more vivid. Alrighty. So her cultural activism. Una Marson, in addition to her literary engagement, which I was speaking too much since I'd started this lecture, she was very politically active in local and international affairs. And this is where Marson really stands out in terms of her legacy that we here in Jamaica are not aware of. And when I say we here in Jamaica are not aware of, yes, I know the academy, people academically know Una Marson, people who perhaps in the theater. So I'm not saying that no one knows Una Marson. However, she is forgotten. She's not known
Especially
as
in our curriculum.
yeah, I was just about to say that we don't see Una Marson in the curriculum, right? You have to come to university if you're even if it's she's brought up, right? She's forgotten. She's one of those forgotten. We hear about Miss Lou, rightfully so, respect to Miss Lou. We hear about Miss Lou and how she used the language and just even how she challenged the literary structure as well. But we never really hear about Una Marson. And her cultural activism is very expansive right here in Jamaica. In Jamaica, her cultural activism goes as far as even children's home, where she worked with the Rastafari community when they were being ostracized, when they were being not just ostracized, beaten. So she took up projects like that. She also did activism around child support.
Yeah.
Yes, she did around child support, suffrage movement right
Yeah.
here in Jamaica, labor the labor riots. In fact, when she came back from England, she was very attuned, like she was very aware of the economic disparity because she said to, I left here with the country looking like this. 5 years later, I come back and the same people who are suffering are Black Jamaicans, right? She was very unapologetic about that. So, and this was going on during the same period where we had people like Marcus Garvey, Edna Manley. This is the same period
Yeah.
where we were making inroads. And when I say making inroads, I mean in terms of using art as a way to articulate,
Right.
right? Articulate the activism. But she wasn't just using the art; she was on the
She was on
ground.
the ground.
So that is why where I see there's a total admission where she was very much active in in Jamaica, and then of course the literary movement that I mentioned earlier. But I wanted to take away the literary movement and separate it now from the more social movements that she was a part of, because she started off as a social worker. She did start off as a social worker. She
And
worked
a
with the
typist.
YMCA. She worked with the Red Cross. So she did start off as a social worker, where she would go into homes and again doing all of what social workers do. So wasn't really a surprise that that
She
became
would work
she
with the
would
people
work.
on the ground.
And I should have mentioned as well, she owned her own newspaper, the Cosmopolitan, in the 20s, 1925, 26, and she used that again. She used her magazine. It wasn't a newspaper; it was a magazine. She used that magazine as an outreach because that is where she would highlight issues that were affecting women. Right? Again, she used it for suffrage. Right? So we see that on the ground that it wasn't just her literary work, right? She didn't separate, she didn't divorce the two. She was actually a cultural worker out there in the field. And then on an international level, I could stay here all day, but we will just touch on a few because I know they'll come out in our discussion. On an international level, Marson also did extensive activist work. One, I will share, she worked with Haile Selassie. She was his personal secretary. And even after her work was completed with Haile Selassie, she continued to work with Ethiopians
Yeah.
where the brothers, she's continued to work underground, so to speak. So she was a part of that Mussolini Abyssinian conflict that we don't hear about. And she was
Never heard about
never
it.
heard about, right? And she was very much a part of it. So even just as a separate from the secretary, when her job was finished, she was still doing work around that. And she was a active feminist. She was the first black woman to attend the in Turkey the feminist organization, and it was then where she was able to make that connection of race and gender, and she was a part of more feminist movement, and we can go on and on, but they'll come out in the discussion. So, why Una Marson? Um, what is her relevance today? I think we can learn a lot from Una Marson, her work, just as the way we valorize and we champion the works of others. As I said earlier, she was doing a lot of the same thing Claude McKay was
Yeah.
doing. And I would go as far as saying, you know what, Claude McKay left and he never came back. Right? I'm not trying to condemn him because remember, Claude McKay is one of my cultural possessions. But the truth is, Una Marson maintained a connection to Jamaica, and not just Jamaica, to the Caribbean, because she did tour the Caribbean when she
Yeah.
came back and she saw what was happening during the labor riots, because it wasn't just in Jamaica it was affecting St. Lucia, the oil in Trinidad. So she was very much connected. She didn't just leave and didn't come back. And
Yeah.
that is why, even more so, she should be recognized. So, very quickly, just to wrap up, her relevance today should be seen in so many ways. Her promoting pride in Black identity and cultural heritage is very important, especially, it's important and timely because every year we are met with the issues, controversial issues of how to groom one's hair. We still have that stigma around black hairdos. And Judah Marson was writing about that long before, right? Her poem, Kinky Hair Blues, Cinema
Yeah.
Eyes. Cinema Eye talks about how television manipulates, right? Where the daughter is being cautioned. She says to the daughter, you can't watch no more TV until they start to show black women that look like us to represent you, because she knew how much it was affecting
Was influencing.
or influencing her daughter. So that promotion of Black identity and cultural heritage, she was very true about that. Challenging racism. I know people would say, no, Jamaica's not racist, right? But the colorism that she experiences as a youngster at Hampton High School, it wasn't colorism, it wasn't shadism. I'm always saying there's no such thing as shadism or colorism. It's
That's
racism,
racism.
because these ism manifest into racism. They're a manifestation of racism. That we
That's where
don't.
they're from.
They're from
Racism is a
a
foundation.
foundation. You don't just have colorism without. You can't have one without the other, so to speak. And highlights its challenges, colonial legacy present in society, which we talk about every day, right? We see it. And most importantly, I think it's relevant today because it highlights the power of art and media in social activism and representation. So there's always this argument that, literature, art, it's just something that you just do idly. You
Yeah.
don't, it has no function, it has no purpose.
It's
It's
extracurricular.
extracurricular. Yes. And it can be, right? It can be, no doubt. But what I like about someone like Gila Marston's work is concrete. So while her work, yes, it is, literary art, it was very powerful because it was able to become a part of that Black internationalism, the Harlem Renaissance. And we see how it works even from the Harlem Renaissance. We see how the impact that it has on society, on how it's affirmation through Black culture. And we see that, Marcy was able to do that. And also social representation. We saw that as well. She was very, very, very quickly before I leave. And this social representation, it was Una Marson who started, because she worked with the BBC, and
Right.
she did the
I was going to
Caribbean
mention
voices. Oh,
that.
you can still mention it. She used the Caribbean voices to mainstream Caribbean literature
Yeah.
because no one knew anything. Well, who knows what about Caribbean literature at that time? And it was through her that program that writers like Lamming, Nepal, a lot of our literary giants that we celebrate, they were able to make their mark on
Right.
that program. And that again, that is representation. And these writers, some of them, they're no longer just Caribbean writers and a part of this Caribbean literary canon, but now they are international writers,
Yeah.
right? So I'll end it there and I'll allow you to ask questions.
Questions.
Yes. I didn't get to read one of this poem, but I forgot which one, but it's okay.
You'll
It's
remember
all good.
it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tomlinson. That was a very full, I don't want to say lecture, but
It wasn't meant to be a lecture, it was a
for an
conversation.
unsung heroine, that was what I thought when I first met Una Marson. I was like, what? Who is this lady? Why didn't we hear about her before? But you dealt with it fully for anyone of our students who may be doing any research, who wants information. This is a very full interview for you to reference and cite anytime you have that work to do. But there are a few points that I want to highlight. We're going to ask your audience to put your questions, your concerns, your comments in the chat. And Dr. Thompson will try to respond to those. All right. So, one of the first things I want to comment on was how you began the presentation about Claude McKay being a predecessor to Una, 16 years. So I wondered if there was any kind of interaction between the two and their poetry.
I'm glad you asked that question because I have been looking for that answer and I'm very
Oh,
serious.
wow.
Yes, I have not come across because they would have crossed because the same time she was interacting with the Harlem Renaissance, Claude McKay would have been a part of the Harlem
Yeah.
Renaissance. And it's interesting that she had interaction with Langston Hughes, who's also considered one of the fathers of the Harlem Renaissance,
Yeah.
and she was also interacting with, again through letter writing, and she was interacting with James Weldon Johnson, and she had a short interaction with what's Zora Neale Hurston, because in fact her Stonebreak, that's what it's called, the Stonebreaker,
Stonebreaker.
yeah, her Stonebreaker poem, it parallels Hurston's what's it called? There's this anthropological thing that she does, and she talks about stonebreakers. Is it
It's just that every time you mention the Stonebreaker, my mind goes straight back to Manuel Road.
really okay? Well, it was
That's all I can think about.
Hurston had done some anthropology work around that, so I'm thinking she would have been exposed to their work as well. So while she's connected to these through letter writing, I've never, and till this day, I am still looking to see if these two cross any path.
Okay, well, maybe. I don't want to say in the spirits. You know, I don't want to say in the spirits.
Possible.
But possibly.
Yes.
I got the chance to read the book. The book. Easy read, guys. Very informative. See, it's so thin. When I turn it sideways, it disappears. You need to get Una Marson. It's a part of the Caribbean writers biography
Caribbean,
series.
the Caribbean biography
Right,
series.
Caribbean biography series. And you can get that book very inexpensive and very informative. So another thing that you mentioned quite a number of things I wanted to say, was her work with His Majesty, and I connect that to the play Pocomania as well as the work with the Rastafari community.
Oh,
Because I don't know, Una was so ahead of her times. I think maybe that's why she got dropped between the cracks and not mentioned, because for her it almost seemed to me when I was reading the work that it was voluntary work that she was doing,
oh,
that this was not paid work that she was doing with His Majesty.
yes. In fact, a lot of the work that I mentioned, even when she worked with the League of Negroes,
Yeah.
that was voluntary work. And a lot of her work she did, even with the poetry societies
Yeah.
that she worked with, they were volunteer work. There was a period, one of the thing with William Marson, not clinically, so don't, this is not quoted to say I said that she wasn't clinically diagnosed as depressed, but there were times,
Oh, she
yeah, there
did
were
speak
times
about a
where,
lot of
yes,
depression
there
and
was
darkness and
and
alienation for
alienation
being so
for
different.
being so different. And then because of that, sometimes she'll disappear from the scene. So you wouldn't hear from her for 2 years. So, for example, when she went to the U.S., where she got married for a very short
For a
time,
very short
no one
time.
really knew what was happening. And
Yeah.
while she was in the U.S., she wrote children stories. In fact, she went back to school and she studied, I think she studied some writing or screenplay and theater. And she was out of sight. So no one was hearing about her.
Yeah.
And her work was being published in magazines
And
or
in a way,
newspapers in the
she
States.
seemed to have been a loner because she doesn't talk a lot about friends. Even in her writing, you outside of the cousin and the other people that she would
Cousin Angie.
represent, yeah, cousin
Exactly.
Angie, she doesn't bring a lot of characters that you would say, oh, this was her friend or from her childhood or in her adulthood, or she seemed to have been a loner. And I wonder what caused that in her.
There's a twofold story that I get from it. So as a child, she wasn't very close to her mother. As she got older, her father died at a young age when she was young, and she had to. That's where her education sort of disrupted.
Yeah.
So what had happened? She had moved to Kingston to be with
Kingston.
her mother and her sisters, and there's one of her sisters, Etty, where she was very close to. A lot of her friends or associates, if you want to use the term, they were along the line of her activism. So
Yeah.
in her the feminist movement, she would have been friends. Even when she was a part of her early exposure to Pan Africanism, Garveyism, Amy, I think it was Amy Bailey. They weren't on the same length because
Yeah.
that is where she learned some of her feminists from, right? But they weren't like friends as we would do
Right.
it. They weren't friend, but she did have most of her friends would have been in that circle,
Okay.
but outside of that circle, she was a loner.
Yeah.
I know in the more extensive bio, Jared Macaulay's bio, Dahlia
Okay.
talks mentions her being a loner.
So I know we spoke about the activist work that she did internationally and how the issues that she would have had in London as not being British. And she would return to Jamaica to refresh herself, to revive. But she also was not very comfortable in Jamaica, I thought, from her writings in terms of being accepted. What were some of those issues and how how did she deal with that?
Okay, her writing was not accepted, as I mentioned in the lecture. Her writing, when it deviated, especially from the British conventions of literary convention, it was highly criticized.
I guess what I wanted to say is how she had the same problems in Jamaica that she was having in London,
Oh, I was gonna get,
even though
yeah.
she was coming
So
home.
in Jamaica, she actually, when she came home the second time, she was treated like like royalty.
When
So
she
her
was
second
still
time,
writing good.
her first visit to Jamaica, it was for her to escape the racism. She was coming to rest, for some reprieve, because it was like it was she went through a lot, very
That's too
stressful.
much.
It was too much. However, when she started to her activism, she actually started to become accepted, because her second visit, she talks about it, how she was treated like royalty. And not only that, she was mentoring people like Andrew Sulky, and she was mentoring a lot of young writers. She was a part of that literary movement, so to speak, again, for free. She was reading their manuscripts, they were reading for free. So I think her first being, her experience, from what I've gotten from my research, her outcast was more in the literary circles, because even her romantic poems were criticized. They were uneven. They were never good enough. And that is why she found solace. That's why she found friendship with the Harlem Renaissance,
Yeah.
and because they were the ones affirming her work. Langston Hughes, when he came, she didn't get to see him because she was ill, but she had asked a friend to pass on her work, and he gladly he featured, I believe, it was two of her poems in his collection. He thought it was great work because it spoke to that new Negro, the new Negro voice,
Yeah.
right? So I think it was more her work was a challenge. It was not received.
Yeah.
Yeah,
In a way, I felt like that might have been what contributed to her depression or the depressed state not being accepted locally and internationally, but finding a kind of home in a space where she didn't want a home. Because the way you said that she didn't really want to go to the US, she didn't want to go
no,
to America, but that was where she found affinity. But the places that she traveled back and forth, the UK and Jamaica, it was a place of struggle. So it's almost like she could not exist without this. But like she had some kind of passion that she have to do this.
that's
She
true.
couldn't let it go. I was just wondering if it didn't make her happy, she couldn't let it go.
But one another thing too, what that when you read between the line, because when she goes to the
That's
U.S.,
what I'm trying to do.
yeah, when she goes to the U.S., she's very discontent because the segregation, she sees it's even worse in America because she couldn't fathom how she could not use the same bathroom as a white person. And then she couldn't understand how America, like Jamaica, they're so Christian, but yet they were practicing this you're right, the equality was so the disparity between, equality was just too much. So what I think, before I we end, a lot of the depression that she suffered from was a result of her being discontent with not being able to change the world or see the world the way she wanted to, right? Because
Yeah.
it wasn't just an easy fix.
Yes.
When she went to the States, she didn't get to experience the Harlem Renaissance. Instead, she was battling with the racism. So the Harlem Renaissance that she read about, these people
Yeah.
who were there for her, she never got to experience that. Instead,
Yeah.
she had to be up against race issues. And then her short stint of marriage. And then she was very, again, going back to England the second time, working at BBC, the racism that she faced there. So this delusional, way of wanting to fit in and can't, and
And the BBC was very interesting too, because in the book it said that it also created a place for Caribbean and African people to feel more like it brought more audience to the program because they could hear her voice, to hear a voice that they could identify with. And I was like, wow, how did this not come up about Una at all?
and before that, she had before the Caribbean Voices, she had a a, a radio show that was devoted to soldiers who would
Calling London, calling
yes,
London,
and
yes.
they would just like what we do during Christmas. People, hey, big
It's
up the
like
family, to
greetings
Toronto,
across, greetings
yeah,
across
greeting
the
across,
world.
yeah, and that was also,
She was ahead of her
yeah, she
time.
was ahead of her
And
time.
as a female existing in a space that, she's supposed to keep quiet, and she didn't have kids.
And
That
she
was
had
another thing.
she had no children. She wasn't married, but
Well,
as
she
I
was shortly married.
short, yeah,
Married ish.
very short, but she did so much, and she
Yeah.
was doing the same thing that artists, whether writers, intellectuals, were doing at the time, using their work as that activist for an activist platform. Yet she doesn't get that same recognition, and I think her work goes beyond just artistry
Okay.
because it was concrete. She was on the ground
Yeah, yeah.
like a Walter Rodney, grounding with
With my
my
sisters.
sisters and brothers. She was grounding with her brothers, sisters, her children. When I say children, because of the children home that she
Yeah.
had taken,
So before the
adopted.
online audience grabs me, let me take a few questions. I Before that, I wanted to mention how the issue of skin bleaching is not new, right? And how we like to, my daughter said this is not the right word, how we like to troll this generation about things, right? Because in the poem Kinky Hair Blues, she's talking about straightening hair and bleaching skin from that time. And maybe what bleaching was then and now are two different things, but that's another conversation. But just to say that it's a topic of discussion for a while now, centuries, if we can say that.
Well, that's part of the inferiority complex, and that's
Yeah,
part of the self hate that we were taught. That goes with the British, right?
yeah,
The British teaching, because her poems, that collection of jazz poem, not just Kinky Hair Blues, but that entire set of poems is affirming blackness. It's saying that you don't have to look a particular way. You're white, your standard of beauty, receive standard notions of beauty.
okay,
So, and that has always been, I guess, because we have social media and because it's more open,
yeah,
it becomes more a part of it's not that it's been more a part of a reality, because it's always we could talk about when we're younger. I'm sure
yeah.
any black young girls could talk about it, how they were called dryad,
I mean,
blacking, or
they
blacking
they
tutus.
could just
They could
ask
just
me.
add, yeah,
I mean, I got a nice name though. I got a name like Black Mango.
oh, black mango,
You know,
okay, that's nice.
among blackie.
Well, black mango smooth.
Right.
So it's always been there, but she, would have been one of the first
Yeah.
to highlight
And I
it.
can imagine she had a strong personality.
And it was a part of in Cosmopolitan, when remember where she
Her
questions
magazine.
her magazine, where she questioned, why is the Miss Jamaica always
Yes.
white, why, or half white, why can't they be black women, are there
And those
nice,
are some of the things that created conflict with her and the
yeah,
Jamaicans.
the middle class,
Yeah.
yeah. And again, because she was interrogating the system, when you start to interrogate the dominant culture, you kind of
Yeah.
get yourself in trouble. So
Yeah.
perhaps, not perhaps, some of those would have been inappropriate for this a woman
So
to be
talking about
addressing.
interrogating the dominant culture, for you writing about Una, what first drew you to write about this? And this is a question from our audience, seeing that she's not someone well known.
Okay, so there are two things. I'll do this very quickly. So I came to know about Una Marson as a teenager
Wow.
through learning about Claude McKay.
Oh,
However, I had no access to material about her, so she just was a figment in my imagination, truly, because I was
wow.
able to go to the library and find material. But this was abroad, so I was able to find Claude McKay, but I could not find Una Marson. This is when I was about 16, 17. So when I finally got to university, one of the first thing I did was I majored in literature, and I used to have a 6 hour break between my classes because I lived far from the campus. So I had to just
Okay.
stay. And that break, I remember distinctly, I used it to go to PR and PS, the library codes, to find out about Una Marson and other Caribbean literary writers, but Una Marson. So I was able now to start to find out a little bit of
Bits and pieces.
bits and pieces. And then when the first book that I did, and my thesis, I engaged Una Marson. So
Okay.
this book now, it was like a gold mine, because um, Professor Carolyn, she had suggested, that this,
Be a part of the Caribbean biography series.
well, not she didn't suggest it was a part of the biography series. It was, she gave it up and said, "Why don't you do it?" I was like, "Really?" At
She
first, I was
called you
like,
out.
Yeah, and she wasn't aware of all of that background, and I was totally shocked by it. I was like, "Thank you, Carolyn." So thank you, Carolyn. Yes.
Okay. So you answered the other question about challenges faced given the gaps in the material because you said it was sparse in short words. Another question is how did your background as a scholar of Caribbean and diaspora literature shape the way that you wrote the book, the way you presented it like?
That's a very
So
good question. It shaped it a lot. That's an excellent question, because when I was writing the book, I wasn't writing it from an academic perspective. I was first and foremost writing it where anyone could understand it. So I was writing it from the layperson could read it.
so we could put this in the high schools.
Yes, so it could be in the high school. So that
Literature.
was one. But the diaspora, because you said you read it,
Yeah.
so I thought, okay, was very important that we talk about her work within the context of internationalism, because I see myself as an internationalist. Not in the
Yeah.
sense of being traveling all around the world, but in terms of how I look at black politics. And that's his, Una Marson. I see myself as a diasporic individual person as well, because that is
Yeah.
my experience. And that is also Una Marson. And I also see myself as a nationalist, as a Jamaican, and as a regionalist Caribbean. So that's a very good question. So all of what has shaped Una's world or her work, that is what has shaped my work.
Yeah.
And my, or not even just my work, because this is
Many
not even my work.
similarities.
That has shaped my perspective as a my identity. So I use those markers, and that is how I was able to put together. Okay, how am I going to put this book together? So I'm
Representate
gonna.
this
This is
part.
how I'm gonna look at it. So that's a beautiful question. I never thought
Okay.
of it like that, but thanks.
Okay, they're wrapping us up now, but I still have another question.
No problem.
Are there any aspects of Marston's life that you wish you could have explored further?
Yes, I still want to explore two things. I want to not just one. I want to explore more her work with the Rastafari community.
Community.
Yeah, so I would like to explore that more because I I found it interesting that she worked with
His
Haile Selassie, His
Majesty.
Majesty, and it so happened that that connection was not because of her work with Rastafarian. It was very much within her social work
Yeah.
experience. And I also want to find out if she and Claude McKay had any contact.
Encounter
Yeah,
at
encounter.
all.
And that's something that I can't find. If anybody's watching this lecture this afternoon, please let us know.
Anybody with a link.
Anybody with a link.
Right.
Yes.
So the final question I would ask is I think this is important. What parallels do you see between Marston's struggle for visibility, because you're the one that really brought some light on her, and the struggles of contemporary Caribbean women artists or writers?
My parallels,
Yeah.
struggles. Well, the parallel struggle is that they're women. And we also have to intersect it as well because Black Caribbean women, we know that it's going to be even more difficult. And also, it depends also, we see from Marson, it's going to depend on the subject matters that they're going to engage. So
Okay.
I see those parallel struggles because I'm still not seeing a lot of, for example, women Caribbean in film. Literature has gotten better because we're seeing, I think the 80s had opened up that door, not just for the Caribbean, but we saw that even in terms of African Americans, we saw the 80s really bringing in, bringing forth marginalized literary work. And I think Caribbean women were a part of that, right? They were a part of that movement when the early 80s where we were into Black women writing. I think the Caribbean
Okay.
women were benefited from that because that was a time too where you found few persons like Honor Ford
Yeah.
wrote about Una Marson. And the first length, the first bio was also, I think it was the late 80s, early 90s. So that period had opened up that
The
door.
80s opened the
Yeah.
door.
But in terms outside of writings, I still see Caribbean women facing that invisibility. Like,
And how do you think that could be improved? Do you think there's anything that can be done about that?
well, with social media, I think it is improving because social media, you're not, no, you don't have to wait on people. You don't have to wait on people to market your work or put your work out there. So I think social media, because topics that you think that people don't want to hear about, it might just be within your circle. It might just be within Jamaica or the Caribbean. It
But because in Jamaica, people think, oh, you're a poet, you're a writer. How is that financially beneficial? You have to be in certain networks, you have to know this person, that person. So I think that was very useful to say social media. We underestimate the power of social media.
yes,
So to students in high school, university, young people that want to write, you have a passion and you want to put your work out there. This is definitely a way to do that.
and we do have writers out there. We do have the big writers, the Marlon James.
Yeah.
We do have women writers who are also big out there. I mean, we have new crops coming up all the time.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you very much, Dr. Tomlinson. This was a very good discussion, guys. Me and Doc could go on forever.
Yes, we
But as you
can.
say, because of time. So we thank you very much for staying with us, and do remember to leave your questions, your comments in the space below. I'm getting all type of signals. Yes, I'm the dinosaur. But just a few announcements for you until our next session of Curating Culture. Please note that the ACIJ JMB office will be closed to the public until December the 1st. If that information changes, we'll be sending it out on our mailing list as well as on our social media pages, which I am encouraging you to follow us at ACIJJMB on Instagram, Facebook, and on X. For events coming up on November the 27th, we have an online panel discussion titled Knowledge Reparations, a decolonial approach to museums, libraries, and archives. A link will be sent also via our mailing list and our social media pages where you will be able to join the event. Thank you very much for staying with us. And until next time, we'll see you on Curating Culture, where we curate to educate. Thank you.